I'd like to begin with the city in which you were born, Vienna before the First World War, where there was a tremendous intellectual and artistic flowering with Freud and with the logical positivists, for example. What were your own early intellectual interests?
You must distinguish between pre and after the war. I was 15 when the war broke out, 18 when I joined up and for a year fought the Italians, and only in 1918 then that I came back and started to take part in public life. But my childhood and early is very important because I come from a purely biological family tradition. I then changed. It was the excitement, the political excitement connected with the war and the big collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which shifted my interest from a purely natural science background interest to a political interest. And only at the very end that I decided to study law in order to specialize in economics. But it was the political excitement at the time which opened to me a new world. I had lived in the pure university and academic atmosphere. My family had been for generations, and my brothers and even my children became biologists. So I left the traditional thing and became a natural, political scientist, one now calls it.
Now, the First World War was an event which had a remarkable impact on a whole generation of intellectuals. Would you say it had much influence on your later ideas?
Well, the break-up of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the whole problem faced by this was probably one of the causes which made me shift my interest from pure natural science to political problems. It meant observing the collapse of a society, and more especially the collapse of the intellectual society of Vienna. Vienna was, as you said, and remained for another decade, one of the great intellectual centers of the world. Nothing could be more exciting than Vienna of the 1920s and the early 30s, because I left as early as 1931. But the number of what were called Austrian or Viennese schools, which were active at the same time, the most famous, of course, is psychoanalysis, which never interested me much, but in law, in anthropology, in economics, in art. And everywhere there were world-famous Viennese schools, most of whose disciples are now spread all over the world. But Vienna was not only in this sense a great university, it had an exceptionally good public. I mean, you could speak to large audiences of highly civilized intellectuals, which I ought to say was a byproduct of a very peculiar situation. The Vienna had a very large Jewish minority, who were not literally excluded, but whose chances in academic life were very small. They all became professionals of one sort, but retained an intellectual interest, with the result that there was a large public to whom you could speak, I think as great or as greater than any part of the world. And it was this audience you had which kept an intellectual life going in Vienna, which, if it was not dominated by this group of Jewish intellectuals, was conditioned by that. That I mention this only because it explains why the position of Vienna as an intellectual center has so largely disappeared. It was the expansion of the Jewish community. In fact, I always say Vienna was then divided into three groups, and that is historically quite important. A purely non-Jewish group, which largely dominated the university. I don't think till I came to the university I knew a single Jew intimately. There was another type, a mixed society, in which I at once entered, as I entered into the university, and a purely Jewish society. Now that was it was a similar situation in two other Central European cities, Budapest and Prague. And they, of course, for the later Nazi occupation, were largely dispersed over the whole world, and that is the cause of the end of this great Viennese center.
Now, In what direction did the breakup of the empire and the great political turbulence of Vienna in the 20s push you? I mean, for example, the inflation was presumably a major factor in your ideas.
By that time, of course, I was a fairly competent economist when the inflation really expanded. Originally, it was that as every young intellectual attracted by socialism of a mild sort. I probably was, when I began my study, but in England they've called a Fabian kind of approach, and convinced that there must be an intelligent solution of the many dissatisfactory events of this world. And so it was as a mild socialist that I decided I must study economics. I was very soon cured of this belief that socialism was the solution, because I came after 3 years under the direct influence of Ludwig von Mises, who had then published his great book on socialism, demonstrating that the socialist solution was impossible in a technical sense. I think the most important thing I then did learn...
Could I just interrupt at that point? You say socialism is impossible in a technical sense. Now, what exactly do you mean by that?
It proposes a solution which is not a solution. You cannot... Well, it takes a long time, but it's my central problem. Socialism assumes that all the available knowledge can be used by a single central authority. It overlooks that the modern society, which I now prefer to call the extended order, which exceeds the perception of any individual mind, is based on the utilization of widely dispersed knowledge. And once you are aware that we can achieve that great utilization of available resources only because we utilize the knowledge of millions of men, it becomes clear that the assumption of socialism that a central authority can command all this knowledge is just not correct.
So what you're doing is you're turning on its head the common point one often hears from the left, that because the problems of modern society are so difficult, that they require planning. You're saying because they're so complex, they make planning impossible.
Well, I think the nicest form to put it is to say that socialism, protesting against the production for profit and not for use, objects to what makes the extended society possible. Production for use is only possible in a society where we know all the facts. But to achieve the situation where we are all working for people whom we do not know and are being supported by the work of people we do not know, is made possible because we produce for profit. Profit is a signal which tells us what we must do in order to serve people whom we do not know.
Yes. Now, you and von Mises put forward this criticism in the 20s.
Yeah.
What reaction did you get from the socialists of the day? What reply did they make to that fundamental criticism?
They were unwilling to admit the factual argument. They preferred to withdraw on the fact. This is a difference of values on which science cannot decide. Once you accept the socialist values that we must be guided by a conception of just distribution, all the factual arguments are irrelevant. Well, of course, the factual arguments prove that the just distribution is impossible unless the distributor knows all the facts. So my answer is, if the factual assumption of socialism were correct, it would be a moral duty to aim at the just distribution. But you have to recognize you cannot do it. In fact, you can produce enough to maintain the present population of the world only because of a spontaneous process or mechanism which enables you to make use of infinitely more information than any central authority possesses.